Amen. Today's text comes from Acts of the Apostles, chapter 10, verses 30 through 36. In your pew Bible, it is on page 894. Acts chapter 10, verses 30 through 36. Cornelius answered, 3 days ago I was in my house praying at this hour, at 3 p.m. Suddenly, a man in shining clothes stood before me and said, Cornelius, God has heard your prayer and remembered your gifts to the poor. Send to Joppa for Simon, who is called Peter. He is a guest in the home of Simon the tanner, who lives by the sea. So I sent for you immediately, and it was good for you to come. Now we are here in the presence of God, to listen to everything the Lord has commanded you to tell us. Then Peter began to speak. I now realize how true it is that God does not show favoritism, but accepts from every nation the one who fears him and does what is right. You know the message God sent to the people of Israel, announcing the good news of peace through Jesus Christ, who is Lord of all. The word of the Lord. God shows no partiality. The book of Acts is more of a historical book than the other books in the New Testament. Luke and Acts are written by the same author. We call him Luke, the doctor. And what he did was that he went about the business of interviewing people who had been with Christ, who had been around Christ, who had been with the apostles, and who had experienced so many of the things that were said about Jesus. And he wrote them. He wrote them in the Gospel of Luke. Then here in the Acts of the Apostles, not only is he writing about the things that he heard from the many people he interviewed, but he's also sharing of his own experience. For it is believed that Luke was one of the people who traveled with Paul. As often he says, we were on the boat, or we traveled. So it is assumed that he walked with Paul. And so when he writes not from a place of firsthand experience himself in terms of the Jesus story, but he writes from being told all of the stories about Jesus. And when he writes about his experiences with Paul, he shares it from a more personal perspective. But here is one of the stories that were shared with him. For this is a story of Peter, the apostle. Peter, the one who had denied Christ. Peter, who walked with Christ and yet was still hard-headed and still maybe said things before he thought it out. Peter, who was also the rock on which the church was going to be built, as Jesus had told him. Peter, who in Acts chapter 2 stood up before a crowd of many after the Spirit of the Lord had descended and began to preach. And a crowd of 120 people became 3,000 in one day. This is the Peter who we're reading about here in this text. As Peter was waiting and praying in the town of Joppa, he got word that God was going to do something. He got a vision. He had a vision. He had a vision that he saw this what looked like a sail of a boat that came down, and upon it were all these different animals. And as a good Jewish man, he knew that there were animals that he could not partake of. So he couldn't eat pork, and he couldn't eat shellfish, and he couldn't eat things that were unclean. And on this sail, on this blanket that came down in his vision, there were all these animals that were unclean. And he heard a voice that said, go, kill, and eat. And he said, no, I can't do that. I'm a good Jewish man. And then he had the vision again, and then a third time. And then the voice said, do not call unclean what I have called clean. And as soon as that finished, a man came to his door. It was the men sent by Cornelius. And who is this Cornelius guy? Cornelius was actually a military person. He was in charge of the army in this place, in his town. And during this time, he became a true believer in God, the Jewish God, which was difficult to say the least. He was a good Roman citizen who believed in the good Jewish God. And he prayed, and he believed, and he gave. He lived out his belief in a way that was probably very odd in that day and time for someone who wasn't Jewish, for someone who didn't have that belief, for someone who didn't come from that culture. It wasn't easy to demonstrate Jewish beliefs in that day. But this military leader, Cornelius, believed. And God said, send men to Joppa to get Simon, who is called Peter. And he did. And Peter came after having his vision. That's where our text picks up. Cornelius, the military man. Cornelius, a believer in God. Cornelius, an oddball in his culture. For though they had many gods, it was easier for Roman citizens to accept the belief in many gods than to accept that one God was the God. And he believed that there was only one God, and that God was the God of the Jewish people, Yahweh. And Yahweh had sent Jesus, the Messiah. Because on the other side of this, and I know I'm kind of going into history a little bit, but it's important because too often we apply our 21st century eyes on this text, and we start to take things out of it that maybe at first glance shouldn't be. But here it was vitally important because at this time, Christianity wasn't the Christianity that we have today. It wasn't its own religion. It wasn't its own belief. It was in fact a sect that came under the umbrella of Judaism. It was part of the Jewish faith. There were these people who believed that this Jesus was the Messiah, and they were all Jewish. They were all people who believed in one God, the God of Israel, the Jewish God. And God sent this man Jesus. God was in this man Jesus. God sent his Messiah, Jesus. So it wasn't the same Christian church that we have or see today. So for Peter to look upon these Gentiles, these people, these outsiders, these people who were not a part of who he was as a person, of who he was as a believer, of who his culture said was God, these were outsiders. For Peter to say that he now realized that God did not show favoritism, but accepts from every nation the one who fears him and does what is right. The impact of these words on us today probably are not very much. But for Peter, it was a whole new world that was opened. For there was no God outside of Judaism. Jesus came under the umbrella of Judaism. Jesus was a Jewish man. Jesus spoke to Jewish people. Jesus was a part of the Jewish community. The church that came after Jesus were all part of the Jewish community. But yet here, for the first time, Peter's eyes are opened. It reminds me of the John passage of the blind man where he said, I don't know who he was. I don't know if he's a prophet. I don't know what he is. All I know is that I was blind, but now I see. For the first time, Peter sees that God is bigger than the Jewish community. And that, I don't know if I can express it enough how mind-blowing that must have been for him. This man who walked with Jesus, talked with Jesus, betrayed Jesus, saw Jesus after he resurrected, was forgiven by Jesus who had resurrected, was the first man to stand up for the church on the day of Pentecost. This Peter just had his mind blown by God. His eyes opened by God. His way of thinking was changed completely by God. All that he knew for a fact had just changed. How amazing is that? How amazing is that? And here we are today, after all this time, we have a treasure here in this text that we don't even realize, because we read it and go on and move forward and say, well, that's just the way it is. But no, it wasn't always that way. And when we look at this text and put it into today's context, how many things are there in our world? How many things are there in our world that we are absolutely sure that this is exactly the way it's got to be, because this is the way it's always been and this is the way it's always going to be? And yet, how many of us are willing to see or to believe that God can take us beyond the blindness of that tradition or that moment? For God still opens our eyes and our hearts. God still amazes us with the love that goes beyond what we can measure and what we can understand. God still can blow our minds with love, with mercy, and with grace. When we think about today's world, when we think about today's church, there are a whole bunch of hot button issues that come in and they accomplish nothing. And actually, I don't know why this week has been talking about hot button issues, but they are intentionally that. They're made to be circular so that you never get anything accomplished, so that it distracts you, so that it prevents you from having your mind blown by God, by being able to see beyond what is the usual, what is the normal. Here, Paul is reminding us that we live in a community that should welcome all people, all creeds, all cultures, those who are within our circle, those who are outside of our circle, those who believe exactly the way we believe, and those who believe differently. God is calling us to be a community together as one, to support one another, to help one another. For we all have sinned and we all fall short. For we all have stumbled and we've all been picked up. For we've all done what we shouldn't have done. And we've all said what we shouldn't have said. But yet, God's mercy and grace still abides in and around us. How do we live out this call that Peter lives out here? I realize how true it is that God does not show favoritism. How do we live that out? For me, I always try to err on the side of love. Whether it means that I'm against what everyone else is, or whether it means I'm with what everyone else is, what God has called me to do. And I invite you to walk alongside me or to reject it. It's up to you, but yet I encourage you to love one another. I encourage you to love as God has loved us. I encourage you to come and walk alongside those who may be different from you, those who you may not agree with and may not agree with you. For one of the things that we've come to in this world, in this nation, in our communities, is that if you don't believe how I believe, then we can't walk together, when that is the worst and most false thing ever created. For no one ever said that we all have to be on exactly the same page in exactly the same moment. What it states and what should be said is that wherever you are, I will walk alongside you. However long it takes, I will walk alongside you. If you've fallen, I will help you to get up, because that is the call of God in our life. That is the call that Peter does to Cornelius and all of those who are with him. For Peter, in the text that comes after, says, "Have you received the Spirit?" And they say, "No, what is the Spirit?" For the very thing that they had been seeking, the very thing that they had been following, they had been doing as they had read and as they were told. It was then that the Spirit of the Lord descended. The Spirit of the Lord has descended upon us The Spirit of the Lord has descended upon you. The Spirit of the Lord is here today with us. The Spirit is not saying that we all have to be exactly the same person. For God knows that would be a boring world, wouldn't it? But yet we walk this journey together. Even if we're not exactly the same person, even if we don't believe exactly the same thing, even if we see the world from different perspectives, we still walk this journey together. And I think that is what blew Peter's mind. That no matter who it was or where they were all able to come together and worship the Lord. They were all able to recognize that Jesus is Lord. They were all able to understand that God had sent Jesus into this world, that God had saved all of those who are here, that God had provided the Spirit to encourage and protect and to be with, that God was walking alongside each and every person there, as God continues to walk with each and every person here today, and here at every church, and every believer in this world, and even those who don't believe. I believe that God is in this world with all people. For God is greater than we give God credit for. God is more merciful than we can ever imagine. And though hate seems to be creeping up and trying to make itself seem more powerful, in fact, it's just empty threats and a big puffed chest that it pounds on, because at the end of the day, at the end of every day, love always conquers hate. Love always wins out. So I encourage us today to love those who are different from us, to love those who don't believe like we believe, to love those who don't exactly think the way we think, to love those who walk their journey a little different than ours. Let us love each other. Let us encourage one another. Let us provide hope for those who need hope. Let us be the strength that others need, even if they are different from you, even if they are not who you think they should be. Let God do what God needs to do in their life. Let God use you to love them wherever they are. Let God blow your mind in this day, in this week, at this time, to open your eyes, to open your mind, to see beyond what's in front of you and to see what could be. Let God blow your mind like God blew Peter's mind when he said that God shows no favoritism, but that God has brought the salvation of Jesus into every nation, into every person, every community. All have the same opportunity. So let us love one another. Let us love our neighbors. Let us walk alongside those who are different. And at the end of the day, love will always win out.